Hello everyone and welcome to today's event on climate philanthropy. We're coming to you from Alliance magazine in London and being joined by our expert speakers as well as friends and colleagues around the world. Welcome to you all. I'm Charles Keidan, the executive editor of Alliance magazine and the moderator of today's webinar. The webinar is part of Alliance at 25, a celebration of Alliance's 25 years at the heart of global philanthropy. This event marks the publication of our new issue on climate philanthropy, our fourth in the last 25 years. Today, we're discussing where climate funding should go to do the most good. And I'm joined by Nigel Topping, the climate action champion for COP26, the world's pivotal climate summit taking place in November in Glasgow. We're also joined by Jennifer Kitt, the founding president of the Climate Leadership Initiative, and Winnie Asiti, an advisor to the Global Greengrants Fund and member of its Next Generation Climate Board. Just a few things before we begin. First, do check out the right-hand side of your screen and use the offers button if you'd like to subscribe to Alliance. Everyone joining today is entitled to a 20% discount on subscriptions. Also on the right-hand side of your screen is the chat. Feel free to say hello to one another there and post your questions. You can also join the conversation on Twitter at Alliance Mag using the hashtag Climate Philanthropy. I'd like to thank Fondation de France for supporting today's event and our wider climate coverage, which is enabling us to begin working with reporters across the global south. Today's event is also an event where the worlds of philanthropy and diplomacy come together. And I'd also like to thank the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and the British Consulate General in New York for their partnership and vital input. And I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague Hannah Young, the Deputy Consul General, who will make some opening comments. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you, Charlie, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. On behalf of my colleagues in the FCDO, I also want to welcome you all to today's event. We commend Alliance magazine for their particular focus on climate this month and thank Fondation de France for their support for this event. The UK, in conjunction with Italy, is hosting the UN Climate Summit COP26 in November this year. This will be an inclusive summit where we will be asking countries, states, businesses and civil society to come forward with enhanced climate commitments. Finance is the glue that will stick these commitments together, and it itself makes up one of our 4 key COP26 goals. At the British Consulate in New York, we have been connecting UK and US experts to share best practice and raise ambition across many sectors, including on private finance, offshore wind, electric vehicles, and other key topics. And to that end, we are most pleased to join today's discussion with all of you leaders from the philanthropy sector. As a January Alliance magazine article highlighted, philanthropy can play 4 roles on climate action. Philanthropists can help shape the climate debate, they can build networks, they can invest for climate, and they can fund climate initiatives. And we need this type of engagement with the philanthropic community. The scale and pace of the transition required is huge, and we need all forms of finance to complement each other to drive that change. When I speak to philanthropic organisations, they talk about making a difference and accelerating change, and that's what climate needs right now. And private finance is increasingly flowing in the right direction, especially for large-scale mitigation projects where the return on investment is clear. But we still need innovative financing to reach the parts that aren't receiving that investment right now. And we also need philanthropies to use their powerful voices to direct the funds and activities of larger investors and corporations to a net zero resilient future. So I look forward to hearing from our esteemed panel today on how we can work together to boost philanthropy towards achieving our climate goals. Your talent, passion, networks and resources can only amplify further that great climate action underway. And thank you all for your engagement on this vital issue.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks to you and your colleagues at the British Consulate General in New York for your efforts to raise climate ambition across government, business and philanthropy, all points that we'll be picking up with Nigel Topping in just a moment. So now to our panel discussion. Our panelists will speak for up to 5 minutes and we'll leave plenty of time for questions and discussion after that. And I'm delighted to welcome our first panelist, Nigel Topping. And Nigel, in his interview for this special issue of Alliance magazine, said that philanthropy is playing an incredibly influential role. So Nigel, if I can hand over to you to talk a bit about the role it's playing, as well as your assessment of where we are on the road to COP26. Welcome, Nigel.
Great, well, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to join everybody today, and thanks to to Hannah for the platform and for the introduction. Yeah, I thought I'd start, given that we are now officially less than 100 working days before the beginning of COP, 20 weeks and counting. With just an assessment of where we're at, and then a few thoughts on the crucial role of philanthropy. I mean, the simple summary of where we're at is we are a long way from being on track. We're going to have the 6th assessment report come out from the International Panel on Climate Change in August, and it will tell us once again that not only are the likelihood of us breaching 1.5 or even 2 degrees gone up, we know that because we still haven't done enough, but the risk associated with those temperature increases is also assessed as being higher. So scientists are starting to get scared. So it's no wonder that more and more young people and activists around the world are expressing their frustration and anger on the streets. We are making huge progress, though. I mean, politically, we have the G7 all committed to net zero and increasingly focusing on the need to halve emissions by 2030. We have a huge groundswell of commitments from so-called non-state actors, cities, businesses, investors. Hannah mentioned the investment community. I mean, 160 asset owners, asset managers, and banks with over $70 trillion of assets under management now committed to net zero. But even if you add up all of the improving country plans, you still get way beyond 2 degrees. So we've got a lot of work to do to bend the curve down of ambition to keep 1.5 alive, which is the UK presidency's #1 goal for Glasgow. But increasingly, what I think we're all seeing is there's a huge execution gap between ambition and policies and actions that have been taking place. So I think that on mitigation, we can say that there's really good progress being made, but we have to focus on what are people actually doing in the next 5 and 10 years. And that's going to be unknown all the way to Glasgow, I think. I don't think we can bank this as the net zero COP yet. It might be the net zero ambition COP, which is a ratchet, but not action. So there's a lot of work to be done focusing on action. But remember, Paris is a 3-legged stool: mitigation, resilience, and finance. And the other 2 areas, the execution gap is much bigger. The resilience has been the poor relation to mitigation forever. And in fact, quite a lot of philanthropy only tackles mitigation. So there's a clue there of an area where I think we need more philanthropic help because resilience is complex and needs systemic change, and it's largely overlaps with other philanthropic domains in terms of the development agenda, but also finance. There's been an obsession with 100 billion totemic figure. It's right that there should be an obsession. That's what the global north committed to the global south in terms of climate finance, but it's only part of the puzzle. It's necessary but not sufficient. The world needs to deploy $4 trillion worth of capital every year to make the investments needed to get to a zero carbon resilient economy in the global south. So we need to massively leverage that 100 billion. The good news on the 100 billion again is that the G7 have very strongly confirmed their commitment to delivering it. But again, there's an execution gap. It's not been delivered yet. So, all eyes, and I know Alok Sharma, the incoming president of COP26, is very focused on trying to mobilize the UK's peers to match the doubling of climate finance that the UK has committed to. So overall, I'd say a long way from guaranteed success, huge progress politically and from non-state actors, private and actors in local government, but a real focus on the execution gap, and much more needs to be done on finance and resilience. Just a few thoughts on philanthropy. Look, the role of philanthropy is huge. I've just sort of listed, driving collaboration seems to be one of the big ones. Look at what, the way that the voice of city mayors has become so powerful. A lot of the, a lot of that initial funding from Bloomberg banging together organisations together. At a smaller level, being quickly able to deploy key staff. I know in my work, sort of Bloomberg and ECF and SIF have been really helpful in just helping fund individual staff positions quickly to bridge what otherwise might be a gap in momentum. Driving collaboration. I mean, the organisation I used to run, Women Business, was only possible because of a hugely generous and I think visionary piece of philanthropy from the IKEA Foundation, which also led to the foundation of the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is now playing a crucial role. Organisations like the Global Environment Facility and Oak and MAVA that helped the Global Commons Alliance get up and running, which I think is going to play an increasingly important role. Fast start in certain circumstances. You either start fast or you do nothing. I was in that situation. I was appointed in February and had to get a team up and running within 2 months. Fortunately, CECG, which itself is a collaborative platform, and Generation Investment Management were able to very quickly deploy significant funds to allow us to bring in a lot of people. And then finally, I think making markets. I think I've been really impressed with some of the work that SIF and others have done in the Southeast Asia energy in terms of using philanthropy to help get onto the curve where markets can start to adopt. So, and I could go on. It's always about innovating in that gap between what the markets will do and what policymakers are ready to do. And when successful, those projects eventually get taken off by markets and policymakers, but that can often be a very long wait. I think of CDP as an example, which has been philanthropically funded for over 20 years, or for 20 years now, and finally we're getting to mandated climate disclosure in some capital markets in the world. So I think a huge role to play, and never more important than now when we're already a year and a half into the decade of delivery and we haven't yet bent the curve, with a crucial COP26 ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for that introduction and for pointing to some of the ways in which philanthropy is at its best, that it's most nimble, where it can play a role that isn't necessarily played by the market or the state. Just want to ask you, in your interview, you talked about the need for philanthropy to do more around the private sector. You said sometimes philanthropy can be allergic to working with the private sector, but many of the levers of power that can be pulled are there. What areas do you see there that philanthropy could focus more on?
So I think there's a real tautology in in quite a lot of philanthropic thinking that says we'll fund policy change, but we won't fund private sector change. But the thing is, policymakers get to extract a tax from the market, and it's their job to change the direction of markets, right? Who's paying for the innovation to change the way that markets pay? So, Carbon Disclosure Project, good example. Science Based Targets Initiative, Say on Climate. I mean, or the work of Share Action. You can go on and on and on. All these initiatives which are using the tools of the private sector, so information, investor pressure and engagement, to change the behaviour of the private sector. I think there's too many philanthropists say that's something that business should be doing anyway. Well, okay, same thing. That's something that government should be doing anyway. I think that the test of good philanthropy should be, is it delivering on its mission of changing the world to be better in whatever way it defines? And so I think being allergic to intervening in private sector because the private sector should sort itself out is inconsistent. And I think we need a bit more courageous philanthropy to go there. There are some great philanthropy there, but unfortunately it's a minority of environmental funders around the world.
Well, it would be interesting to see whether philanthropy learns from its experience of working with the private sector in global health over the last couple of years, and whether some of that will apply to the environment. And Jennifer Kit, I'm sure, will pick up on some of those thoughts in a moment. But before we turn to her, I want to go to an audience poll. If you can look at the right-hand side of your screen and click on the polls button, you should see a question that would be great to get your thoughts on. Where should funders put their resources to do the most good? Now, we're not expecting a comprehensive response, and of course, they're not necessarily either ors, but we did want the top of the mind reaction from all of you that are here today. Should they put their resources to funding intermediary regranting bodies like the European Climate Foundation or Climate Works Foundation, or B, direct to indigenous-led organizations, C, direct to climate justice movements, D, to de-risking private sector investment in clean energy, E, to climate litigation against companies or governments, or F, climate education in schools and communities? Just give you a moment just to post your responses, and then I'll read out the initial reaction we're getting. Well, interestingly, just looking at the fact that there may be no particular either-ors, we've actually got a real split and distribution across those categories, with 20% approximately saying directly to Indigenous-led organizations, 20% of people here saying to climate justice movements, 15% to the de-risking private sector investment, 10% to climate litigation, and only 5% around climate education. We've also asked you to tell us in the chat, and please do that if you've got some other thoughts on or ideas on that. Should also note, in relation to climate justice movements, given that 1 in 5 of you are saying that that is an area for philanthropic backing. According to the Climate Works data, only $60 million goes there out of the $1.6 billion a year of climate funding. So it might reflect some of the kind of global north biases of the funding that Nigel was alluded to, but that might be something for Winnie to pick up on. But thank you for your responses there. Keep the conversation going in the chat, and thanks to Nigel for his opening comments. I'd like to turn now to Jennifer Kitt. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you for joining us very early in the morning and from your annual leave to be here today with us. Jennifer is the founding president of the Climate Leadership Initiative, which is a very significant body in the philanthropy sector to galvanize philanthropic action at this critical time for addressing climate change. Welcome to you, Jennifer. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to be with you. Charles, you asked me to use the anniversary of the Alliance magazine, 25 years, to sort of reflect a little bit with all of you on what's happened in that time frame for climate. So I thought I'd just share with you that the early philanthropists realized that an overheating planet would unravel all of the progress that they had made even at that time and have continued to make since then, and things like empowering women and girls and alleviating poverty and protecting precious places like the one I get to vacation in here now. And because of that, a small group of them, some of them actually were mentioned by Nigel in his remarks, came together and began to collaborate. And philanthropy has actually helped push the global governments and businesses in all kinds of ways so that we are no longer on a track to an overheating planet of 4 to 6 degrees, which is what it was 25 years ago. But the bad news is that we are still close to 3-degree heating, even if the Paris Agreement commitments are implemented. So there's a lot that philanthropy needs to do to actually move us into a safer space for climate targets. And, you heard the sense of urgency from Nigel and how philanthropy can actually speed the changes. I also noticed from Nigel that he shared with us, right, that so many people will say that businesses should do these things anyway, or governments should move as quickly as we need anyway. But what happens is there are obstacles to change. And so philanthropy can help speed the flywheel of change in leveraged ways and make things go faster. I have a couple examples I wanted to share from you. One of them is an example of eliminating coal in the United States. The Beyond Coal campaign started in the United States in the early 2000s and was supercharged with a $50 million gift in 2011. Overall, about $250 million in philanthropy went to that project. And it's one of the most successful things that philanthropy has ever done in the climate area. So what did they do? They funded boot camps to teach lawyers and volunteers how to block polluting coal permits for the very worst coal-powered energy plants in the United States. They led trainings for community members and moms and dads to understand how the air quality was killing their families. They helped with workshops so that once one community defeated the power plant fueled by coal, another community could learn from them. And they also funded strategic communication so that people understood all of this. And it was enormously, enormously successful and has saved more than 10,000 lives a year since then because of the air quality, but also shut down the very worst polluting coal energy plants in the United States. Now it's actually that this project funded by philanthropy is actually spread across the world and is actually working to move to clean energy solutions in other places as well with geographically appropriate strategies. So that's an example of a relatively early funding that has had already a major influence for climate and actually for health. So a couple things that I will share with you that is helpful for those who are new in entering climate philanthropy. The first is that philanthropy actually will make a difference. And you heard that from Nigel, right? That it will speed changes in important ways. You heard him talk about the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, or the science-based targets. These are places where philanthropy has funded organizations who are actually holding accountability for the kinds of commitments that organizations make, so that we know that they are actually going in the right direction. The second thing for you to know if you're new to climate philanthropy is that collaboration can make the solution scale faster. And so looking for places where you can give along with others, sometimes with those who are more experienced than you, is incredibly important in this space. So let me give you one more example in that regard. As many of you know, surely, nature is one of the most powerful solutions for an overheating planet. And that's because ecosystems like tropical forests and peatlands and even oceans protect us all by removing carbon pollution from the atmosphere naturally. Every day, Indigenous people around the world are actually stewarding their land in ways that help protect it already. And so research shows that investing philanthropy in their land rights and protecting them and formally documenting them has a very high return on investment for protecting these ecosystems that in turn protect us. There are several groups who are doing that work, helping protect land rights or enfranchise local communities and Indigenous people. And all of them could be scaled. None of them are working at the scale that they need. So this is an example of a collaborative giving project that actually can match up and scale in the kind of change that we need today, and is a wonderful solution that exists. There are many, many more like this, and we need more philanthropy to come into this space. Less than 2% of global philanthropy is going to solving the climate crisis today. So good for all of us to know as we think about how to make the changes happen faster.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for your opening remarks, and a very poignant note to end on, being that still less than 2% of funding from philanthropy is going to climate change, to address climate change. So with that in mind, and given that climate intersects with so many other causes backed by philanthropists, what are you finding persuasive for funders who are not traditionally engaged in climate work, but maybe on healthcare or education, but can begin to see their other work through a climate lens? Do you think that might be the route to actually increasing that figure and getting more funders involved, not just the kinds of people that are already committed to the cause that Nigel was referring to earlier?
Oh, actually, Charles, you don't have to be a climate donor to help solve this problem. Given the urgency, so we didn't go over this, but let me just pause on it so that everyone fully understands the urgency. In the next 9 years, scientists are very clear that we have to cut emissions in half and then continue to do that every decade so that we get to what is called net zero, or almost no emissions at all from fossil fuels, by the middle of the century, 2050. That is actually a level of change that we have never done as a community of humanity before. Weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels, now that we understand their damage, is incredibly challenging to do. And we have that in front of us. We need every resource possible to make that happen, right? But if I love nature and I'm a biodiversity donor or an oceans donor, or I care about a particular region in the world, like Africa or India, I can actually have two good things at the same time, because since climate solutions are very often actually making life better, like that coal example that I gave you, making life better for people, you can actually intersect your interests and have very powerful solutions that help us solve the problem at the same time that you're helping us make a better world.
Thank you, Jennifer. And clearly, climate intersects with so many of these issues. So broadening the tent of the climate philanthropy community seems like the way to go at this particular moment. And with that in mind, I do want to bring in Winnie Asiti. Winnie guest edited the Alliance issue on climate philanthropy. She's also a member of the Next Generation Climate Board of the Greengrants Fund, which make grants on green issues and young people making grants around the world. And in your article, in your lead article with your co-guest editor Felicitas Von Peter of Active Philanthropy, you talked about the need for philanthropy to change at speed and scale and to direct more resources to the global south. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Over to you for some of your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you very much for organizing this session. I'm really glad to be participating. And I have to start off by saying it was a great honor guest editing the Alliance issue of June with a focus on climate philanthropy. Just direct to your question and linking up with what Jennifer and those that spoke before said. Obviously, there is a very huge need to increase funding to climate action across board, especially so in the global south, where we see that there is very little funding coming in for climate action. And the most important thing at the moment is for funders to actually consider funding climate action as part of their other funding, even if they are not specifically climate funders, as has been mentioned before. So you find a lot of linkages with things like, for example, health and climate. So funders need to increase their funding for climate action and also integrate funding climate in their activities so that we can start now to see the numbers in terms of the amounts that are going to climate action increase much more than we are seeing right now. Another way that I think funding could be, changed, how philanthropy could address this issue much better is by focusing on grassroots organizations. You just saw the poll, and a lot of people have responded, pointing out where they believe the funding should go. I believe strongly that these should be targeted at grassroots organizations, be they young people, women organizations, indigenous communities that are really placed at the front line of these climate impacts. You find that people, for example, living in the Amazon are now grappling with impacts of climate. They can no longer be able to draw their livelihoods as they did before because of the changing climate. You find that communities that, for example, are traditionally pastoralists are no longer able to continue keeping their livestock because of the changing climate. Now it is becoming more unsustainable to continue with their lifestyle. And I think for me that these are the people that the funding needs to, go directly to. So climate funders should really direct resources to these groups of people. I also believe that a very critical way could also be to integrate climate as part of their own organizational workings by ensuring that they are divesting from fossil fuels, for example, to make sure that all their action that they do is actually focused towards contributing to combating of climate change. And with that, we will start to see a change in the patterns of funding that is going to climate philanthropy. And then in terms of what potential I feel that philanthropy has, especially to support what I've just highlighted. I'm a member of the Next Generation Climate Board, and one of the things that we have been doing very well over the past few years is giving small grants to youth organizations in the global south, small grants averaging about $5,000. And for me, this has really taught me that there is huge impact to be seen from such small grants. An example is a group in Iraq, the Arab Youth Climate Movement, whom we gave some funds to advocate for unleaded fuel in their country, and they were actually able to do this. This was a bunch of young people that, you know, were able to actually realize this change in action. We've seen also in a place like Ghana, for example, the group and the gentleman that won the Goldman Environmental Prize last year for advocating against the installation of coal plants in Ghana. This is actually a result of the small grants that had been given to this particular organization. So there is real potential in, you know, funding at the grassroots. Even small grants do make a huge difference. We have seen from the articles that the Alliance issue that is out now that social movements, and especially looking at climate justice, are a very critical area as well in terms of amplifying voices and bringing attention to this particular issue. And Isaiah in one of the articles talked about this role of climate justice movement to be able to mobilize awareness and generally knowledge and build capacity of people around issues to be able to more forcefully advocate for change and for action. And this is a critical area that has to be funded. And just to wind up again on the issue of funding, one study actually has found that for each $1 invested in climate funds, the returns are up to $4. So it's actually smart investment. So I think philanthropists and all other, you know, funders across board should think of this as a long-term investment that actually does have very, very good returns. And just to wind up, I just wanted to say that today happens to be the day of the African child. So it is also a call for all of us to secure the future of this African child that we are celebrating today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winnie, for your comments, and indeed for guest editing this issue of Alliance. It's been a pleasure to work with you. When we've spoken to lots of young people and interviewed them, one of the questions you've asked is about what they hope is happening when we have this conversation again in 2030. But we never got to ask you that question. We got to see varying degrees of optimism or pessimism about progress from, in some cases, very young people. So could I just briefly put that question to you? What are your hopes for, you know, that next generation board that will be evolving and becoming an older generation soon, if we're talking in the next few years?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think for me right now, I'm very optimistic, especially looking at the trends. You spoke about the amount, the 2% that, you know, was committed to climate philanthropy in 2019, as documented by Climate Works. What is interesting about this figure is that it has been growing, and also the number of funders to climate justice and climate action has also been increasing. So in 2030, what I hope to see is a transformative climate philanthropy, basically, where you have a lot of funders that are actually funding meaningfully to be able to achieve this change. Funders that are more, you know, flexible and, you know, encouraging these models of participatory grant making, where even those that are receiving funds actually have a voice and a role to play in terms of, you know, making decisions on what is important for them. And then I'm also hoping to see that young people, communities at the front line, the most impacted, are at the front line of decision making, not just in philanthropy, but also in very, very critical processes like the upcoming COP26. I hope by then we won't be having COPs again, because we would have somehow come to, you know, solving this challenge. And the COPs that we'll have then will be much more, you know, a celebration and trying to maintain the momentum that we would have created by then. So for me, I really, really want to see in 2030 that, you know, young people are at the front line, communities are at the front line driving action, and that funders have really, you know, transformed, changed their perspective, and are funding in a meaningful way to combat this climate problem that we are faced with. Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie. And if you want to read more, I'd encourage you listening here to look at the interview that Winnie conducted with Misreem El Saim and Kasim Touri from Sudan and Ghana, respectively, which is a really dialogue looking about the future of where they want to see climate philanthropy and the climate issue going. So thank you for that, and also thanks for your note about flexible funding and the return to trust-based philanthropy, which is a big theme and trend in our sector more generally. I've been looking at the chat, and I'm seeing some questions that are being raised around the climate commitments and pledges that are being made around the climate world to increase funding to those areas. And at this moment, I'd just like to bring in Nigel Topping on a specific question around the climate action tracker. Nigel, there's a climate action tracker that holds governments to account. And I'd be interested to know how effective you think it's done that, and whether now that all these pledges are being made for increased climate funding, you think a climate action tracker for philanthropy would really help to hold our sector to account and to raise the level of ambition. Could you see that model being transposed into the philanthropy world?
Interesting idea. I mean, the climate action track has been hugely helpful. It's a collaboration between several really expert NGOs and academics. For me, that's an important note, that a lot of the most impactful initiatives right now are collaborations, because there's always a time in a process of change when you need kind of 1,000 flowers bloom, but then there also comes a time when if there's been a bit of evolutionary selection, which ones are working or not, and you need to start really converging on the solutions. So I think and different bits of change are at different phases. So I think it's been very effective. It's something that a lot of us point to and rely on. I mean, I don't know. It's very interesting. I mean, we expect governments to be held accountable by voters. We expect businesses to be held accountable by consumers and investors. I'm not sure who we expect to hold philanthropy accountable. It's kind of accountable to itself, right? So I think transparency is always helpful because it keeps people on their toes. So I don't know methodologically how you do it, but I think a collaborative platform where all climate philanthropists hold themselves accountable would be a good thing, as long as it didn't chew up too many of the resources that they are trying to distribute to things making direct change. But generally, transparency is really helpful.
Thank you, Nigel. Jennifer, do you want to respond to that point, just around how we can hold our sector accountable for increasing our level of ambition? And that tracker is funded by Philanthropy, the one that supports government action.
I like Nigel's warning that you don't want to use philanthropy to take it out of the field when you have a problem as urgent as this one. I think he's right about that. There are many existing collaborative platforms already, and there are organizations that track where the money is going. It's just not easy to do, actually, especially once you get out of foundation funding. So I think we have those platforms, and we just need more money to be flowing to the solutions and partnering with each other, not making up their own things. And if we have that, there are actually already platforms that can report on what's happening.
Thank you. Well, to talk about money flowing to solutions, one solution that's been relatively neglected, but we've had a question pre-submitted actually from Mark McCaffrey, is around climate education. He's from ECOS, the UN Climate Change Community for Education, Community and Outreach. And he said, having worked in climate literacy for engagement for over 20 years, my experiences at the philanthropy community, like national governments, have been rarely supportive of literacy and engagement efforts. But we know from research, from education, schools are integral to the needed social tipping points towards climate resilience. So what can be done, he asks, for community engagement around climate to be receiving more support from philanthropy? We saw in the poll that it was also a bit less of a priority. How much action is needed there? Jennifer?
It's a good question. I mean, I actually see a fair amount of community engagement and grassroots activism and philanthropy going to help communities understand what's coming their way if they don't act up, because it is, Nigel mentioned this in the beginning, and so did Winnie, it is people who have to demand the things of their governments and of their companies and of the systems to get the changes to go. So I see a fair amount of community engagement. I think we need more, but we need more in sort of everything these days. I also notice in the youth, right, that they understand climate science because they have mostly been taught it in schools, whereas people who are as old as I do, we didn't learn it. So making sure that they understand it and continue to actually use their voices and their efforts to kind of keep us moving in the right direction is incredibly important, and an important part of the ecosystem of funding for sure.
Thank you. And in your earlier remarks, you mentioned the Beyond Coal campaign. And there's a comment from John Cracknell in the Fred, who's a climate activist, researcher in the philanthropy sector. And he mentioned the need to challenge the political power of the fossil fuel industry. And I'd like to just ask Nigel, what do you think the most effective ways are to do that? We know that there's organizations like SIF that are pursuing climate litigation, but we also know that, the industry not only is powerful, but it also allows jobs to be created, which is why the UK coal mine in Cumbria hasn't so far been ruled out. So how do you think philanthropy can help maybe challenge the political power of that industry?
Sorry. I mean, there's lots of ways, right? I mean, there's funding research into the job creation potential of the clean alternatives. There's all the investor routes. I mean, look. Recently, we've had some very interesting shareholder resolutions, including kicking off the board incompetent directors who are leading the company in a crazy direction, kind of head in the sand, assuming that there's some sort of counterfactual where we don't solve this and we're all fine and they can pump oil forever. There's changing the plumbing, like working on technical things like the task force on climate-related financial disclosure or accounting rules to force companies to disclose the real embedded risk. There's lobbying to get the IEA to publish a 1.5 degree scenario, which has just come out. That's largely been coming from activists and NGOs saying that the IEA are not doing a good enough job. That's a stunning report from a very influential publicly funded body, which says we should not fund any more fossil fuel exploration. I mean, it's really game changing. So I think there's the thing is when you use a big term like the political power of the fossil fuel industry, you've got to dissect it down to a lever that you can actually apply pressure on. And so that comes down to a legal instrument, or a data instrument, or a policy instrument, or an intellectual argument. So I think the only way you can tackle that is by breaking it down and finding something specific that you can actually do.
Thank you, Nigel. I believe Winnie, you wanted to come in, either responding to that, or indeed if you want to respond to the question about climate education and empowerment.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I just wanted to follow up on Nigel's comment right now. One of the things I also believe is that private sector players normally respond really well to regulations. So do you have a regulation? Then they can be able to adhere to these regulations. Sometimes it's really difficult for them to sort of be at the front line to go before the regulations is in place. So I guess processes to support this type of thing could also be something that philanthropy wants to invest in. I also wanted to make a comment about the question on climate education. One of the things I've also learned being part of the Next Generation Climate Board is that when it comes to climate education, it's also two ways. Whereby you find that communities that are placed at the front line and experiencing the impacts of climate change have a lot of knowledge and education, so to say, to offer. And I know that some of the initiatives that we have funded, and we've definitely funded some of these in the Canadian Arctic, is where you had the community elders sort of sharing their knowledge in an intergenerational transfer of knowledge on how they dealt with climatic changes, how they were able to cope and adapt, how they were able to create resilience to the younger generation, so that this sort of knowledge and information is actually passed down. And for us, we have seen that this is a really powerful tool of empowerment, not only for these older generations that are sometimes just, sort of neglected because people might not think they have a lot to offer, but they have these lived experiences that they can be able to offer to younger generations and even the rest of us as a lesson of how communities have survived changes and how they continue to actually adapt to their circumstances. So I believe that's a really important aspect of climate education that we always have to reflect on. Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie. That's very clear. Would anyone else like to comment on that? Or we can move to another question. Please keep questions coming in the chat as well. Well, question for you just about the Jeff Bezos's Earth Fund. He's committed 10 billion in climate funding. He's spent a small proportion of that so far, and he's recruited some of the top climate talent to lead his organization. There's been a lot of discussion about Mackenzie Scott and some of her very enlightened regressive grant making in the last 24 hours. Just wonder, Jennifer, what your hopes would be for the impact that a fund of $10 billion to be spent in the next 10 years could have, and how you hope to see it operate, given your work with very significant philanthropists.
It's incredibly hopeful. That amount of money could leverage all kinds of wonderful things, and I'm sure it will. They've already in the first year moved about $1 billion, and I know that they will stay on a pace given the leadership that's there now, very respected in our field, Andrew Steer in leadership there. So I think we all dream of many, many, many funders like that coming in order to help us with this flywheel of change, right? Funding the movements, funding the accountability, funding the solutions, funding the ideas, funding the innovation, all of it at the same time so we can get where we're going together. I know that the Bezos Earth Fund is actually really thinking about very carefully collaborating with others and partnering and giving all around the world. So I expect it to be a model for others. And I certainly do hope that more philanthropists who have that much resource will commit a large percentage of it to the cause.
Thank you. Any responses to that from Nigel or Winnie? If not, I would add
that. Look, it's a given. I think that I take it's a given. At least that everybody working philanthropically would love to have more money to mobilize, right? Because we're all working in this game to try and make the world a better place. So more money coming in is just good. I think for me, one of the things I hope is there are some really important bits of the climate or sort of ecosystem of organizations that have just been chronically underfunded forever. And I would hope that it's Heather O'Grady at Rockefeller RPA said a while ago, what we need is funders to go big, long-term and flexible. So to stop tying management teams up with reporting as though they had 20 different boards, so that every single small grant is subject to more scrutiny than a board of a whole organization might give them. So I think that removing the existential making payroll stress from a lot of talented NGO CEOs so that they can just get on for a period of 3 to 5 years with making a change will be huge. And so that's, for me, I think that could be the biggest thing that these kind of big new commitments could make, is it could actually free up so much of the human talent, which is what drives all the change.
So to go long, big and flexible seem to be the watchwords for philanthropy. You mentioned in your interview that the search for silver bullets can be counterproductive and lead to that more fragmented and short-term funding that we really need to avoid. Just want to pick up on the shadow side questions around philanthropy. We all want to see more ambition, more resources, more funding, but we also want to see, and we see this in the sector, actions that are consistent in terms of the values with the foundation's funding. Are there, and Winnie mentioned this at the start, are there concerns that some of the large climate funders, for example, the Hewlett Foundation or the Wellcome Trust, are still investing in fossil fuels in order to maximize their returns, while at the same time funding on the grant side? Or Bezos, for example, flying a rocket into space at the same time, and using combustible engines at the same time as wanting to reduce, address climate change. Is there a danger that in our sector that we set ourselves up for inconsistency or accusations of inconsistency unless we put those values into practice in ways that seem seamless? I just want to bring Winnie in on that, and then also to invite comment from you, Jennifer, and Nigel.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, one of the challenges I think we are faced with is you have funders that are, really doing double speak. So on one side, you're trying to do good, but then on the other side, your actions are not really matching up with the funding. So I think there needs to be a much more amplified call for funders who are doing this to actually, practice what they are trying to address. You can't be talking about moving towards net zero and so on, but you still continue to invest in fossil fuels. And I think this really needs to change. And we have seen this recently. There was this court case against Shell. I'm sure some of you have seen it, and where they were actually being asked to set up commitments, climate commitments, basically, even though they are not held bound by the Paris Agreement. What does this show us? That we really need to also invest, for example, in litigation to actually get some of these corporations to actually, commit to climate targets, and not just be funding a little bit as part of their CSR on the side and saying that they are involved in climate action. This is an example of a private company, but I think it also applies to philanthropy in general, foundations and different funds that are giving money towards climate action. They have to lead from the front.
Thank you, Winnie. Nigel, under what circumstances do you think it's acceptable for foundations to invest their endowments in fossil fuels? Are there circumstances, for example, where a fossil fuel company is transitioning off oil?
Well, I think that's an important nuance about, is divest the right, or do we need to help companies transition? But I think the more fundamental issue is, if you're philanthropically funding a societal change and you're not grappling with that same societal change on the endowment side, first of all, you're definitely being inconsistent. Second of all, one of you is going to be wrong. Now, in this case, it turns out that all the endowments who haven't been steering their investments towards a zero carbon economy have been losing value relative to what they could have done. Because if they've held on to coal, they've lost all those funding. Oil's lost massive. $100 billion was written off oil balance sheets last year as oil companies started to realign their valuations. So I think there's a moral argument, if you want to stand yourself up as being a moral leader as a philanthropist, about doing the right thing. But I think there's also there's a financial argument about, if you're fighting for a future and you really believe in it, then you really need to be consistent, because you're going to lose money otherwise when you start to win. And I think that the two sides of the house can learn from each other, right? I think often there's an arrogance in the financial sector, and it's kind of endemic that they're the people who are the smartest people in the room. The people on the philanthropic side of the house may well have better insights into the way society is changing than the people on the investment side. So I think they can, and then actually trying to make the change through the investment chain might well lead to real insights in terms of what needs to be funded philanthropically. So I would just advocate for the two sides, that getting rid of these artificial walls and I think a silly idea that you do good on one side and just maximize profit on the other side, and actually learn from each other.
Thank you. And Jennifer, does that resonate with you in terms of the conversations you have with some of the philanthropists you work with at the Climate Leadership Initiative?
Yeah, it does. And investing in fossil fuels are a bad investment anyway over the long term. So if you're trying to build a future, you go in that direction. So it's the same struggle that many organizations are going through. How do you transition in a quick and effective way? So yeah, I agree wholeheartedly.
Thank you. Just want to turn to a question in the chat from Rajiv Khanna, who says that a lot of the most sustainable and effective climate solutions are coming directly from climate justice movements around the world that have been chronically underfunded. But this is a big bet that has been overlooked by philanthropy. Now, we all know about the challenges of institutional philanthropy funding social movements and the concerns about not turning them into NGOs. But do you think this is really an area that is poised for expansion? We know that the Children Investment Foundation famously invest in Extinction Rebellion, the climate movement. Do you think there's more opportunity to fund climate movements, particularly in the global south? Just final answers on this before we turn for some reaction from Hannah Young. Winnie, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, definitely. Very many thanks for that. I think, yes, definitely there is an opportunity to continue and upscale what has already started when it comes to, climate justice movements, social movements. I think these are vehicles through which we can achieve even much more action and keep the momentum going when it comes to really achieving, combating climate change. You can see the impact, for example, that the Extinction Rebellion really did have. And so this is something that we have to build on. Earlier, I had already talked about how in one of the articles, the writer talks about the role of such movements in informing the public, creating awareness, and just making sure that climate action is actually at the top of their agenda. And that is more the reason why there has to be increased and sustained funding to such movements so that we don't lose sight of some of the things that are really important, some of the actions that we must do, and that these movements are very, very much capable of holding governments, philanthropists, and all the players that are involved to account over what they have said that they will do. So in that way, it's really, really necessary that, we keep funding them.
Thank you, Winnie. And Jennifer, what kind of reaction do you get from some of the funders you talk to about backing climate movements, particularly those that are more politically edgy?
Yeah, no, I mean, we often have to teach people why that's important, and why people power makes the changes go faster. So we do routinely, but people are coming on board on those things. I want to just note that Nigel said something very interesting about scaling philanthropy and the challenges to that because it's been so starved in this space with less than 2% global philanthropy, it is actually important that we allow people to dream, leaders to dream over multiple years with more multi-year funding. It is especially true of the justice groups and the grassroots groups because they especially need to be able to grow and scale at a level to get the changes that we need. So it's true everywhere in climate, and it's especially true in that space.
Thank you, Jennifer. Nigel, final word from you on that, or anything else you want to say?
Well, really, on that, it goes back to the point I made in the interview about there being no silver bullet. And I think, look, whenever as an activist you win, you have a sort of momentary rush of adrenaline where you think, we made a difference. Of course, it's never quite that simple, right? Because it's systemic. So XR doesn't make a change in isolation from all the work that's been done for decades by people on science communication, on trying to move market, on advocating for policy, on getting mayors to step up. The Shell court case didn't exist in isolation of Extinction Rebellion's work and all those other things. We're all those different pieces. So in a way, I'm really encouraged that your initial poll was relatively evenly distributed amongst 5 or 6 different intervention points. It's no point in us all piling into one intervention now because it seems to have some momentum. We'll need to keep them all going, and it's actually impossible to know, because this is a massively non-linear system, which intervention will work. That's something that we all just have to get used to. And often the failed interventions may, in a funny way, lead to the successful ones in a way that we never know. So that kind of all major levers being pulled at the same time, it's quite an important principle, I think.
Yes, and the question of attribution and impact in philanthropy is a discussion we'll turn to probably another day. But before we wrap up in a moment, I'd like to just bring Hannah Young in from the British Consulate General in New York. Hannah, I know you've been listening attentively to this conversation along with others in government. What's your reaction hearing the kind of discussion within the philanthropy sector about climate? What the messages you'll be taking back to the government?
Thanks, Charles. I mean, firstly, to say this is such a hugely important and timely debate, and I'm really grateful to all of our speakers for their insights and perspectives, and to you for moderating such a rich discussion. This moment is all about raising ambition across the board, and as Nigel said at the start, that's ambition on mitigation measures, that's ambition on adaptation and resilience, and crucially, ambition on finance. And we're immensely grateful to Nigel for all of his efforts in support of this in the run-up to COP26. And it's also a whole of society effort. Governments like mine have a crucial role to play, but we've also heard today how impactful philanthropic funding can be, and how that agility and, as Winnie said, that ability to make on-the-ground connections is so crucial. And then finally, I think, as Jennifer said, we all just need to match the urgency of this moment and ask ourselves what more we can do. And that remains a priority for my government, including for us here at the British Consulate, and really keen to continue the conversation. So please do stay in touch with us through our social media channels if you do want to continue that discussion, including in the run-up to COP. But thank you, Charlie. Thanks for the opportunity to come back in.
No, it's a pleasure, and it's good to bring the conversation together between philanthropy and government. We've got some of the best and brightest people in the philanthropy sector that are putting funding together, pushing the government, and building pledges across the global philanthropy sector for more climate action. So we'll look at, and we'll hopefully be able to see progress in the months and years to come. That's all we've got time for today. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. If you found it helpful and engaging, don't forget to go to the offers button on the right-hand side of your screen and get a 20% discount on an Alliance subscription. And thanks to the support of the Louders Foundation, you can also download a free digital copy of our climate issue if you want to dive deeper into the topic and some of the themes that our panelists have been discussing today. And I'd like to just end by thanking our expert panelists, Nigel Topping, Jennifer Kitt, and Winnie Asiti, for their great contributions today, and look forward to seeing how your work progresses. Thanks to Fondation de France for supporting today's event, and indeed to our fabulous partners at the Foreign Office, in particular, Hannah Young there and her colleagues at the British Consulate General in New York, who made this event possible as well. And thanks to behind the scenes, the Alliance team, Anne-Marie McQueen especially, who produced today's event. And thanks to all of you participating in this webinar for being part of our growing Alliance community. Our Future of Philanthropy webinar series resumes on the 14th of July, when we look at where philanthropy is headed in the US and Canada. And our 100th issue comes out in September. So go to alliancemagazine.org to sign up in advance for that. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today, and goodbye. We'll see you next time.